peak of German speakers in Texas was somewhere between 120 to 150,000. We're basically nearing the end of Texas German. It's probably going to be dead in about 5 to maybe 6 or 7, 8 years.
Der Tag, der ist so freudenreich, alle Felder Türen, den Sonn vom Himmelreich über die Natur.
There was a big immigration wave that took place in the 1840s, of a large wave of German-speaking immigrants coming from Central Europe over to Texas. They were looking to get out of Central Europe mainly for economic reasons, poverty, famines, high taxation, wars going on, but then also for political reasons. There was a democratic revolution, a failed democratic revolution of 1848. And so a lot of people involved in that failed revolution, they had to basically flee Germany or had a fear to be imprisoned or be killed. So thousands of immigrants came over here.
My grandfather on my mother's side was with the first families that came. I think it was 120 that made the first trip. And then my grandmother on my father's side was with that same group of people.
As I said, I was born here, and I have traced all of my ancestors back to the different little kingdoms of Germany. In 1845 is basically when they left. They came at the invitation of the Adelsverein,
the Society of Noblemen of Mainz, the Mainzer Adelsverein. And they offered their services by basically telling people, hey, look, if you want to immigrate, we will provide you with free land, we will provide you with transportation, we will provide you with basically everything you need to set up your new life in Texas. So people would travel throughout Germany, they would go to the port in Bremerhaven or in Antwerp in Belgium, they would go to the Texas consulate, they would sign a contract, they would become citizens of Texas right there, then they would get on the boat, and then they would travel across the Atlantic anywhere between 6 weeks to 3 months.
In my maiden name was Jacoby, Jacoby. They came in 1846. The story there was that they left Germany kind of in the middle of the night. The Nicholas and his wife and 2 or 3 children and the father-in-law, I think. I don't know what the father-in-law's name is. I don't recall that at the moment. Might have owed money or something. But anyway, they got on the ship York and sailed to Indianola. But they never sent word back to Germany that they had arrived. So from that time, 1846, till the early 1980s, the family back there talked about and wondered what had happened. In early 1980, 81, 82, my oldest brother, his wife, 2 children, and my mother and father went to Germany and looked up the family. An older lady had died just shortly before that, and she too had talked about the people who had come to Texas. The family was elated that they finally knew after all this time that they had arrived, increased, and multiplied. My mother had lots of documents along to show that they were, the ship list and different information to prove that they were true Jacobys. They visited one day with Ginther and a number of family members, went back the next day. They were still unsure, how do we know that you are truly the descendants? And Mother and Daddy had enough information and stories, and okay. Finally, they were convinced. They said, turned to his wife and said, well, now go get the good wine, to celebrate.
Many people died at sea. Many people died upon coming to Texas in the 1840s. Different diseases. The Mexican-American War broke out in 1845. There were lots of difficulties for the first large wave of German immigrants coming over here. They landed down by the coast in what's now known as Indianola, which used to be called Karlshafen, named after one of the noblemen of the society who helped organize the immigration. They would then get on ox wagons or horse carriages, and they would travel basically from the coast to what is now New Braunfels and then up to Fredericksburg. They had intended to actually settle in a much different area, the so-called Fisher-Miller Land Grant, which is northwest of Marble Falls, Llano, Mason, but they never really got there because the land turned out not to really be suitable for farming or for ranching. That was one of the big mistakes of the Society of Noblemen. They basically signed a contract for a piece of land without seeing it beforehand, and so they promised German settlers land up there, but when they discovered that they really couldn't settle people up there, they couldn't do any farming, they decided to settle in different places, and that's how originally New Braunfels was founded as the first German town in Texas, and then after that up in northwest Fredericksburg, and then other towns afterwards.
I grew up here in Gillespie County in the far eastern part of the county, close to Blanco County, out in the country, in the rocks and cedars and cactus. I spoke very little English until I went to school at age 6.
The peak of German speakers in Texas was probably the early 20th century, somewhere between the early 20th century to about 1930, 1940. That's when you had the most number of Texans speak German in Texas. The numbers differ. Estimates are somewhere between 120 to 150,000. And the makeup or the concentration of German speakers really differed a great deal. So you had some areas like the Hill Country, let's say Fredericksburg, you had 99% German speakers, the same thing in New Braunfels. But you went to a city like Austin, you only had about maybe 10 or 15% German speakers in Austin. You went to San Antonio in the 1940s. San Antonio was a trilingual city. You had a third of the inhabitants speak German as a first language, a third English, and a third Spanish. And then the further east you went towards Houston, you had mixed communities of German speakers, of Czech speakers, of English speakers, of Spanish speakers, and it really depended on the local situation of where you would go and how many German speakers you would find there.
I was born during World War II when my father was stationed in New Guinea. In fact, I still have the telegram that he received relating my birth. My mother had gone with him the year before when he was in basic training at March Field in Riverside, California. She had never spoken a whole lot of English, neither had he, but I believe that they made it a point to be sure that I could speak both English and German as I grew up. I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandparents who spoke basically nothing but German in the home. So I would say I was bilingual. I don't know which came first. I can't tell you that when I started school.
It is my first language, yes. And when I started school, the summer before I started school, my older sister, Emily, one of her jobs was to sit on the front porch and try to teach me English because we could get into trouble if we spoke German on the school ground.
There were certain words that I had trouble with. Head, hat, I never knew if I was talking about the head or the hat. Just confusion to myself, not that it mattered to anyone else.
There's a number of reasons for the decline of Texas German. One of the main reasons, most likely, is World War I and the pretty intense anti-German sentiment because of it.
Now remember, these were people that had been, and by the First World War, 1917, these were people whose family had been here for several generations. They had no ties to Germany. They were not pulling for Germany in the war. But because they were German heritage, they caught a lot of discrimination. And there were a lot of German communities that made the decision then, hey, we better start speaking English.
My mother grew up in Harper, She was born in 1908, and she was there during World War I. And there were more English people in Harper than German people. There were only 7 German families, and they were frightened a lot of times because of the way they were treated. There was they were also Catholic, and it was just pretty much those 7 families. They were German and they were Catholic. And when they would come to church on Sunday, there would be people they knew from the town would stand and chant that here came the Germans with their sacks full of money to give to the church so the church could send it to Germany to kill their sons. Okay? So that was rather disturbing. My mother said, her father always said, just don't look, just look straight ahead, just don't respond. So.
After the U.S. entered World War I against Germany in 1917, in Texas and throughout the United States, there were English-only laws that more or less targeted the German-speaking population across the United States. So before that, you had a very vibrant life, a very vibrant community life. You had German newspapers, you had German schools, you had German-speaking churches, you had basically the entire community function in German in many places in Texas. From one day to the other, the German got cut out because of this English-only law that basically said you can only teach English at the school and nothing else. So the kids who grew up speaking Texas German at home and in their communities, they would go to school, and one day the teacher would say, guess what? You can only speak English. What do you do if no one spoke English? So the first year or so was really hard because hardly anyone spoke English. So they would not only learn English bit by bit at school, but they would also learn that speaking German is not a good American thing to do, and that if you are supposed to be a good American, you would not be allowed to speak German. Then another world war happened that didn't help the prestige of German in Texas or the United States or around the world for that matter. And as a result of that, really in the late 1940s, early 1950s, that was more or less the cutoff point where most of the Texas German parents decided not to speak German at home anymore because they didn't want their kids growing up with speaking German or even with having a German accent when they spoke English. So the idea back then was if you wanted to be a good American, you had to be monolingual English, and no German was basically allowed anymore.
When we started school, that was very close after World War II. We'd already endured World War I. It didn't become as predominant in World War I, but by World War II, if we came to school speaking German, there was some kind of punishment. Some of the boys remember being rapped on their knuckles with a ruler. And I graduated here in 1962. We spoke about it at graduation and numerous reunions we've had since then. There were about 8 to 10 who said they spoke nothing but German when they started school. And our first grade teachers that I remember, there were very few of them who grew up in Fredericksburg or any place. They were native English speakers, so they were very hard on us. We had 44 country schools in Gillespie County. Some of my classmates didn't join us until high school, and they spoke more German yet when they came to town because they were allowed to go to the far ends of the playground. And my husband, who was 6 years older than I was, went to a country school for the first 9 years of his education, and he often told me the story of where the boys would go to the far ends of the playground to play football or baseball. Their teacher was a native of Fredericksburg. She spoke German, but the rules were no German at school. But they did go to the far end and call their plays and have fun.
If we said, ich like dich nicht, we had to write, I don't like you 25 times on the black.
So then the development took another about 10 or 20 or 30 years, where then throughout the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, you had a process going on that's called language shift, where all of a sudden more bilinguals in the community would prefer one language over the other. So that was then English over German. And then after that, the older generation of monolingual Texas German speakers passed away, and the remaining generation that was bilingual preferred English over Texas German. And then the younger generation of that generation basically grew up not speaking any German at all. They would understand it, they would have passive knowledge, but they would not be able to speak it. And so what we're looking at right now is the last generation of Texas German speakers that acquired it at home from their parents or grandparents or friends in the 1940s into the early 1950s. Texas German is really in a mix of situations where it used to have a lot of prestige until basically World War I, and then it went downhill after that. Starting in the 1960s and 1970s, many people started, quote unquote, discovering Texas German again. But by that time, you already had a generation growing up that wouldn't learn it at home anymore. So it was basically the parents' and grandparents' language. And so it was associated by many people growing up in those communities as something of, the older folks, something that is not modern, something that is, really not cool at all. And so if you would have had a lot of resources and a lot of community support in the 1960s and 1970s, you might have been able to not rescue, but maybe revitalize Texas German across Central Texas, but that was not done. And we're now in an even more difficult situation where we're looking at basically just a few speakers left of the very oldest generation, people that are in their 70s, 80s, and older, and there's no people of the younger generations who still speak it. And so that idea that it's not modern is even more prevalent today than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And you ask Texas German speakers today what they think of Texas German, they're very proud of it. They identify with their heritage. They're really, proud of where their ancestors came from, of their history, of their contributions to Texas. They have a very strong Texas German identity. Not American, not Texan, not German, but a unique Texas German identity. But then you ask them, would you be willing to do something to support Texas German, to make it viable again, to revitalize it? And 9 out of 10 speakers will say no. And then when you ask them, well, why not? They will reply something like, we're too old. Or they'll say something like, well, Spanish is the new minority language in Texas now. It's not German anymore. And it's not practical anymore. So if you are looking for a job, it's more likely that people will be hiring you if you speak Spanish besides English and not German as opposed to Spanish. So in a way, you're kind of caught up in the situation where if you would have done something 40, 50, 60 years ago, there might have been a chance, but that train unfortunately has left the station.
If you know a second language, that's great, but you have to practice it. You have to really keep at it, or you lose it. Over time, if you don't speak it and interact with people, and that's what I try my best to do is not only for myself, but others, get them involved in more, learning more about the German culture, if that's what they want to do, because I don't want to see it die out altogether in Texas. That'd be a real shame.
My children are in their 50s. I have a son and a daughter. They tell us now, we wish you and Daddy had taught us more German. The only time you and Daddy spoke German was when we weren't supposed to hear what you were saying. But they both understood enough by our facial expressions, like if they were asking for something, wanting to go somewhere, either, yeah, they were going to get to go, or no, they were not, just by the way we were talking to each other.
My children don't speak it, even though I spoke German. My family, my brothers and sisters, we still speak German with each other. But my children don't speak it. They know a few bad words, but they had nobody to speak with. And so I think a lot of that happened during World War II, when it just wasn't popular to speak German. I wished it could be reversed, because I think it's wonderful to be bilingual. But I don't know. It would have to, I think, be introduced even at kindergarten or first grade.
But there's another big issue with Texas German in that it's a mixed dialect, which means it's a combination of different groups of speakers coming from different geographical regions in German-speaking Central Europe, starting in the 1830s and 1840s. They came to Texas and their dialect mixed. And then over generations, you had the emergence of a completely new dialect that's different from any other German dialect spoken anywhere else in the world, not just in Europe, but in North America, in Latin America, anywhere else. It's a unique Texas dialect of German. And then it has borrowed a lot of English words into Texas German. And so the Texas German you hear today is a mix of various German dialects with about 5 to 8% of English words mixed into it. And the crucial part is there's an extremely high degree of linguistic variation in Texas German, meaning we have found not two speakers who speak alike. From a linguistic standpoint, that's really important because you have language variation anywhere in any speech community. Men speak differently from women, older people and younger people. You have ethnic dialects, you have religious dialects, you have regional dialects. That's normal. In Texas German, you have no clear patterns in the sense that you can say, oh, people who fit this profile will talk one way, and people who fit a different profile, age-wise, gender-wise, whatever, they will speak a different way. And so if you want to teach a dialect or you want to teach a language, you need to have instructional materials. And for linguists looking at Texas German, on the one hand, it's a gold mine because you have this fantastic amount of variation. It's like a dream come true for a linguist because you get all these different linguistic patterns in just this one dialect. We're in the process of writing a dictionary of Texas German, and it's extremely difficult because there are so many different ways of pronouncing a word. There's different gender assignments. So, it's the feminine gender, the male gender, and the neuter gender in German. And for many Texas Germans, they will use sometimes one gender, sometimes another gender, and so on. And so you run into this problem that it's extremely difficult to even create teaching materials for Texas German, and if you can't create teaching materials, you can't teach it to anyone. So it's a very difficult situation that unfortunately I don't see any way out, which means most likely Texas German will be dead in, unfortunately, I guess 5, 8, maybe if we're lucky 10 years down the road.
There's a lot of words that we use that are actually English words that we substitute.
One of the things that sets Texas German apart is that it really incorporates so many different words from English, but it also makes up its own words. So when English settlers settled in North America and they first encountered this animal that we now know in English as a skunk, they just borrowed that word from a Native American language. What Texas Germans did is they did not borrow the word skunk from English or an Native American language. They made up their own word called die Stinkkatze, the stinking cat. So they basically created their own word for a new thing that they encountered in Texas. And you find a number of those things. There's also words that you find in Texas German today that are more or less outdated. So if you think of an airplane, in modern German, it's called das Flugzeug, so the flying thing. That's what an airplane is. Texas German will refer to airplanes when they talk about them as das Luftschiff, which is literally the airship, which is the old German term for a zeppelin or a blimp.
We get corrected a lot of times by some of the people that have a degree in German. We call it pencil Bleifeder. And I was corrected about that just Wednesday with a lady from Germany, and she said, das ist ein Bleistift. Und ich habe gesagt, tut mir leid, es ist ein Bleifeder, because we're trying to hold on to our dialect. So all of us that grew up here, we all decided it was Bleifeder, which is actually translated a riding feather. And so it's probably still from the 1800s when they didn't have a pencil. And we just never knew the word for it. Somebody brought the subject of clothing up, and I remembered as a child when nylon was invented. And my mother ordered my daddy a really nice, thin, summer white church shirt. And he wore it one time, and the church was not air conditioned. Our car was not air conditioned. And when we came home, he said in German, schmeiß das Scheißding fort, ich tu das nie noch mal an, ich bin beinahe kaputt gegangen, which means throw the blankety blank shirt away because I will never wear it again because I nearly died of heat.
Oh, verses and sayings that we learned that my grandparents would say, like, Duck, duck, dear line, wenn die Kinder klein sein, reiten sie stege Pferde, wenn sie groß sind, reiten sie Pferde, geht's Pferdl, dribbel, drop, schmeißt die kleine Reiter runter, bumm, sticht der Lichte in Graben, which is saying, duck, duck, dear line. I'm not too sure what that means. When children are little, they ride a stick horse. As they get bigger, they ride a real horse, and the horse canters at a faster pace, throws them off in the ditch, and there he lies in the ditch. Another favorite one is, der Weihnachtsmann ist ein guter Mann, der bringt die Kinder, was kann. Die große Laster läufen, die können sich selbst was kaufen, which means Santa Claus is a good man. He brings the little ones what he can. The older ones he lets go, they can buy their own stuff. In addition to those, my dad would often say, as would his uncles, as you were parting company, well, mach's gut, halt dich munter, fall nicht runter, which translates, stay healthy, don't fall down. When you want someone to be cautious, you might say to them, ja, pass auf mal Liste da und schnappst für Luft, which means be careful because you might fall down and be gasping for air here in any minute. Just recently when we get together to speak German, the one lady added to that, ja, pass auf mal Liste da und schnappst für Luft und denk, der Blitz hätte dich in den Arsch getroffen. To me, that was so funny, not only watch out, you might fall down, or you'll be lying there gasping for air, and you'll think the lightning has struck you in the butt. Just funny to me.
Documenting these community languages or dialects are extremely important because you're looking at the cultural knowledge, you're looking at the cultural heritage, you're looking at basically the entire history of a group of people, whether they're Texas Germans, whether they're Louisiana French, whether there's any other group out there. The way that knowledge, the way that history, the way that traditions transplanted from one generation to the next happens through language. Once that language is lost, you lose a huge part of that knowledge. It's not that you cannot talk about it in another language such as English, but the connection, the emotional connection, the closeness in terms of identifying with what your community is, what it does, how it does things differently from other communities. Their language serves as a really crucial factor that distinguishes one community from another community. It would be fantastic if people were to become more open-minded when it comes to other languages, to other dialects, to other cultures, to think about the fact that we're all different, that the US is a country of immigrants, has been for a very long time, and that over time you will simply get different waves and similar waves of immigrants who come in, who will come from a different area in the world, who will believe in something else, who will look differently, who might pray differently, who might have different foods, who might have different customs, different traditions. But if you look at the history of the United States overall, one of the fantastic things about the United States is that you have all these different groups who have in fact come together and who have been able to work this out. So in the case of Texas Germans, it's not the question of are we German or are we Americans or are we Texans. For most of the Texas Germans that we've interviewed over the last 23 years, it's really we are Texas Germans. That's a unique identity that is not contrary to being German or being American or being Texan, but it's a way of expressing an identity of combining all of the best things that these different cultures, that these different ways of speaking encompass, and bringing it together into a unique identity that really makes not just the community of Texas Germans unique and quite frankly stronger because they identify that way, but through that strength comes a way to contribute to society overall. Some of it was not easy. Clearly, the anti-German discrimination was pretty traumatic for many Texas Germans or German Americans for that matter. But if you look at it historically from the perspective of today, you have this unique identity up to this day, despite these challenges. So down the road, I wish people were to consider being more open-minded, being more accepting of other cultures and languages and where people come from and why they come here. Many of the reasons why people are coming to the US today are the exact same reasons why German immigrants came to the United States 100 years ago or 200 or 300 years ago. So that historical perspective, I think, would probably help people understand better, because if you look at the past, you probably should be getting a better appreciation of where we are, and that's something that I think we can all learn something from. We have a website, the Texas German Dialect Project, so if you could just Google Texas German Dialect Project, you will find our link. The URL is www.tgdp.org. And you can listen to lots of interviews with Texas Germans. You can read the transcripts. You can read the English translations of the interviews. We have bibliographies on Texas German. We have different resources for learning more about Texas German language and history and culture.